Hello, everyone, and welcome to our horse talk today. I'm very excited to have Erik Molvar here. I got to meet you, Erik, when we were in Washington, D.C., so it was an honor to meet you and good to talk to you while we were there, and I'm glad that you're here today. Erik is the executive director of Western Watershed Projects, and he can tell you a little bit more about himself. And you guys, like you said, just had your meeting, and there's been a lot of interesting stuff that you've shared, so I'm excited to hear about that. But really, even timing-wise, the article where you talked to Patrick Springer at the Fargo Forum here in North Dakota came out today. So that was good timing for that too. So I'll let Erik introduce himself and talk a little bit about what he does and his role in wild horse advocacy. And thanks for being here, Erik. Just a reminder to everyone is muted. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. And that's just out of respect for our speakers. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris. And again, my name is Erik Molvar, and I'm the executive director of Western Watersheds Project. And Western Watersheds is a nonprofit conservation group that works to protect watersheds and wildlife throughout the American West. We focus very heavily on livestock grazing, and so land health and ecosystem health and restoring native ecosystems are kind of our stock and trade. Personally, I am a wildlife biologist, and I did my thesis research on the evolution of social behavior in Alaskan moose, and then also moose herbivory impacts on Alaskan tree-line ecosystems. So I have a little bit of experience with large ungulates. And back in the day when I was doing my thesis research, my graduate advisor referred me to Joel Berger's landmark book on wild horses, which is a rare book, and a lot of people probably haven't read it, but it's a really interesting scientific treatise about the ecology of wild horses, particularly in Nevada. And some of the same types of behavioral adaptations that you see in wild horses, you're starting to see in Alaskan moose, because Alaskan moose are a recently social ungulate. And they moose everywhere else in the world are pretty solitary. They're serial tending bond breeders, which means that a male moose will go seek out a female in estrus and have guard that female and mate with her, and then go off in search of the next female. Whereas Alaskan moose are harem breeders, and they will gather up whole harems of cow moose and guard them and breed with them, in much the same way as elk or deer. Now, wild horses are considerably more sophisticated in their social behaviors than either moose or elk or deer. And so in wild horses, you see band stallions defending females throughout the year, as opposed to elk or deer or moose, which will only gather up harems in the fall, and then everything kind of atomizes during the winter and spring. And so the wild horses, will have a band stallion that's a dominant stallion that defends the herd, but sometimes that dominant stallion will have a lieutenant stallion that will assist with the social cohesion of the herd and assist with defending that little band from other rival males. And that's something that you don't see in that level of cooperation, is something you don't see in the cervids or the deer family. And then also, one of the things that's interesting to note amongst all the ungulates is that, the males have their dominance hierarchies, and those are really flashy and obvious, but the females have their dominance hierarchies as well.
Right.
And in moose, it's actually true that the females' dominance hierarchies are actually enforced with a lot more enthusiasm by the females than the males do. So that's just an interesting side note.
It is interesting.
But Western Watersheds Project, we're not a wild horse advocacy group. We intersect with the wild horse issue because the primary foe of the wild horse movement is the livestock industry. And just as the livestock industry picks on wolves and mountain lions and has negative impacts on bighorn sheep and trout and sage grouse and tries to eradicate coyotes and many other species like prairie dogs, they're trying to get rid of wild horses too. And we don't like to see the livestock industry call the tune. And we have evolved over the years in our thinking. Originally, when I came aboard Western Watersheds Project, the initial policy that I laid out was a policy of neutrality, basically saying, well, we're neither pro wild horse nor anti wild horse. We're going to approach it from the best available science standpoint. There was a board member who was a wild horse opponent who came forward and said, I want a policy on these wild horses. And so then I drafted a policy on the wild horses, and this was massaged by the board. And this policy goes like this. The species Equus caballus originally evolved in North America, but went extinct on this continent over 7,000 years ago. Most paleontologists believe that today's wild horses date from escapees from the Spanish colonies in the 1500s, augmented over time by more recent escapees. On the other hand, an ethnographic study of indigenous oral histories supports the concept that the horses were already present in North America prior to the arrival of European immigrants. Like cattle, elk, and any other herbivore, wild horses can damage the range in cases where they become overpopulated. WWP supports the Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act, which directs federal agencies to maintain wild horses within a, quote, thriving natural ecological balance, unquote. And this is a standard that ought to be applied to domestic livestock as well, but it isn't. In terms of overall numbers, there are an estimated 22,000 to 78,000 wild horses on Western public lands, compared to 2 to 3 million cattle. The livestock industry and some federal agencies disseminate misinformation about wild horses in an effort to distract public and media attention away from the much more serious and widespread environmental problems caused by domestic cattle and sheep on Western public lands. And WWP endeavors to correct the record based upon the best available science. So that's our thinking on wild horses, which means that we're somewhat of a neutral party. We're trying to become, brokers of the truth and science, and we're trying to truth squad those who are trying to put out false narratives, which overwhelmingly is the livestock industry. Now, I recognize, Chris, that a lot of this doesn't apply as much to the wild horses in Theodore Roosevelt National Park, because number one, you're dealing with the Park Service. Number two, the livestock that are there, the cattle that are there, are few and they're not run for profit. And number three, those horses may or may not be covered under the Wild and Free Ranging Horses and Burros Act. I'm not sure. That seems like a gray area to me.
They are not. The National Park Service actually went to court to be excluded from that.
And so consequently, the wild horses that are there in that national park are in a kind of interesting and different position. And I would think that the role that they occupy is a historic feature, because it is a historic park and
Right.
part of the historic setting of that park. And of course, as everybody on this call probably is well aware, wild horses have been a pretty consistent feature in the landscape of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, all the way back to Theodore Roosevelt himself and before, right, when the Lakota owned that country. So that's kind of an interesting difference, I think, between the TRNP horses and the horses in a lot of the rest of the West.
But I think that where you can help, or where you can maybe shed some light, is, as you said, using science and facts to talk about the different narratives that the park is giving. So one is that if they eliminated the horses, that would leave more forage for the other large ungulates, the bison, the elk, the deer. But I think part of our argument is advocates is they've all been coexisting since before the park existed. So isn't it true? I mean, they're all playing their role in the makeup of the park ecosystem.
Well, one of the kind of narratives that's really consistent by the wild horse haters, I'm going to call them, is that wild horses are an invasive species. They're not native, and really that's a really interesting claim. If you go back to paleontology, wild horses evolved on this continent starting 54 million years ago in the Eocene, and for 53.995 million years, there were wild horses evolving with these vegetation communities on this continent, and this assemblage of wild ungulates, the bison, the elk, the deer, all of the native ungulates. And then based on the paleontology, now the most recent record of wild horses of that same species is 5,700 years ago. And that's the Murchie study that Ross McPhee was part of. And that shows that they were here along with mammoths as recently as 5,700 years ago. Well, if that's true, then between 5,400 years ago and then now we have new evidence that 1544 is the oldest recent sighting. So that's 5,000 years. That's 0.005 million years of no horses versus 53.995 million years with horses. So they whether you or not you call them native, they are certainly indigenous to North America, because the wild horses evolved to the species Equus caballus here. So they came from here, which makes them indigenous. Now, can you say that they're native? Well, I suppose you could, and you could also say they're not. The problem is that native doesn't have a rigorous scientific definition. And so nobody agrees what it means. So everybody can, have a great shouting match one way or the other. Nobody has very strong evidence one way or the other as to whether, definitively they can be considered native. Now, the archaeological and paleontological records are records of searching for things in vast areas of absence of data. In other words, you just because you haven't found something doesn't mean it's not there somewhere waiting to be discovered. So, like we say in science, sometimes the absence of presence does not equate to the presence of absence. Just because you haven't found them yet doesn't mean they're not in the record. But thus far, they're not shown. But if they were found to be in the record between 5,700 years ago and the present, that would lend a lot of credence that they were here all along. And at that point, you'd say, yes, definitively, they're native wildlife. They were here without an interruption. There are a number of species in North America that are considered native wildlife. The elk at Theodore Roosevelt National Park, are they native wildlife? They were gone for decades and got reintroduced. Just like wild horses were gone for a period of years and got reintroduced. At that stage, if the elk are native and the wild horses are not native, then you have a question of, well, how long does an animal have to be gone before it loses its native status? And nobody yet has even proposed a length of time to say, well, if they're gone 1,000 years or 100 years or 5,000 years, then that's long enough. They lose their green card and they have to be, they have to come back in as immigrants.
And I think that's something that we've been arguing here at the park, because the horses were accidentally fenced in the park. So they were obviously in this area when the park was established. The bison were reintroduced in the 50s. And as you said, the elk in the 70s. But those two species are native wildlife and the horses are invasive livestock.
Well, and if you look at it from an ecological standpoint, there are a couple different things going on that the folks in TR National Park ought to know better than I would, which is, number one, are the elk or the bison suffering in any way? Are they dying out? Are they, are their numbers dwindling away to nothing? Obviously, any large herbivore will compete with other large herbivores if they're eating the same forage base.
Right.
But often these different species do what's called segregation in space and time. In other words, they'll use different habitat types in different times a year so that they minimize the competition with each other. So, cattle famously, they stick really close to water. Bison and horses can go far from water, so they can tap into forage resources that are unavailable to the cattle. The elk might require or feel more comfortable if they have either some kind of forest cover or broken country so that they can hide, whereas bison are much more apt to be in wide open spaces, and so are horses. So these are different kinds of ways that they can segregate themselves. At the same time, what you have in terms of an ecosystem in Theodore Roosevelt National Park is what would be considered a mixed grass prairie. So a kind of a hybrid between the tall grass prairie and a short grass prairie with a lot of sod forming grasses or warm season grasses. And these are sod formers. These are much different from the bunch grasses that you have west of the Continental Divide and the Intermountain Basins, which are, decrease a lot if they're heavily grazed. I have seen grazing allotments that the Bureau of Land Management leases out where they permit the cattle to wipe out 80% of all of the vegetation that grows between January and December out on the plains, because they have these sod forming grasses where, all of the growing points are right on the ground. They're really resistant to heavy grazing. They evolved with bison really heavily grazing them. And so they're less apt to be damaged by an overpopulation of native herbivores or non-native herbivores. So, one of the things that you can look at too is how is the range doing?
It seems to be doing fine. I mean, I think part of the argument is, and again, I believe that the bison contribute to the history of the park also. I'm not speaking against bison, but do we need 500 to 700 bison? And if we reduce that number, could we keep 200 horses? That seems like an easy fix to that. But then also too, what the park has been saying, and Patrick Springer mentioned it in the article that one came out today, when the park does talk about the possibility of keeping horses, they're talking about a number of 35 to 60 horses that, the best that we can tell, has no scientific justification. I guess we'll see what their environmental assessment says, but I don't know if you want to speak to that. Like, that number is not genetically viable in any way.
No,
Especially when they're giving every female horse 8 months old and up Gonacon. So then I think that, because we talked about that a little bit, I know in Washington, D.C., that adds to what genetically viable then means for this herd.
Well, that's right. 30 to 50 of any kind of harem breeding ungulate is never going to be anywhere near the genetic minimum viable population. And the genetic minimum viable population for the accepted minimums for any species out there is an effective number of 100 and a total number of 1,000 for ecological viability. Now, the effective number of 100, that means 100 animals, 100 breeding animals in a 50-50 even match sex ratio. Wild horses do not breed in an even sex ratio. You'll have one dominant stallion that might have 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 mares that only are bred by that one stallion. That's a skewed sex ratio. So they have a calculation. It's a formula that you can calculate, what the effective population size is given your sex ratio skew. For wild horses, there was a study done in the Pryor Mountains that figured out a correction factor. I believe it was 0.36. So in other words, if you had 100 horses, you'd have an effective population size of 36. What that means, in order to get to 100 for an effective population size, you need a minimum total number of horses, all age classes, all sex classes, of 278. Anything less than that, you're putting your population at risk for inbreeding. And with inbreeding, you get what's called inbreeding depression, which means a loss of fertility. And so your population tends to spiral into an extinction vortex. You have the possibility for birth defects. You're losing what's called heterozygosity. In other words, the diversity of different genetic alleles that horse population has. And diversity can be really important because if there's a new unique disease that comes over from Asia that the horse population has never encountered before gets introduced, then there might be horses, if you have a really diverse genetics, that have some kind of a genetic predisposition to fight off that disease. But if everybody has exactly the same genes and they're all cookie cutter carbon copies of each other, then nobody is going to survive. So that's another downside of having a really what's called homozygous population, or a population with very low genetic diversity. So you wouldn't ever want to have a population of 30 to 50. And same goes for bison and elk. The fact that they want to keep 500 to 600 bison and elk is a good thing. Now, you can prop up your genetic diversity by introducing animals from outside, from different genetic lineages, and bringing them in to breed with these other ones. But at that juncture, you're almost, running your wild population like a livestock operation with,
Right.
keeping stud books and, manipulating the genetic makeup of the population, which is a really unnatural thing to do.
And that's something that they did do back in the 80s. I think the 80s and 90s, they introduced just ranch horses into the park. And I think most of them were not successful. They had ended up having to remove a lot of dominant stallions and mares to get them to be able to be successful in any way. And I believe that all of them were removed eventually because the other thing is, these are the Badlands of North Dakota. You can't take any horse and throw them in there and be like, good luck, right? I mean, these horses have evolved to live here and navigate through the Badlands. So like they brought, shire horses and bigger horses, and those horses we've seen over time, their offspring are the ones that end up injured a lot. Because again, I think for them, it's hard to navigate through the terrain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it could be. And evolution works in two different ways, in my view, as a behavioral ecologist. And I'm biased because I'm a behavioral ecologist and not a geneticist. So at first, in the day of Charles Darwin, and as evolution kind of was proposed originally, the idea of natural selection is that it was all based on genetics and instinct. And that, the animals that had the superior genetics would survive and have superior reproduction. The animals with the inferior genetics would differentially die younger and fail to reproduce, or their offspring would be less survivable. And over time, those genetics would be weeded out of the population. So you'd move through evolution towards a well-adapted species to its environment. And that's part of the story. The other part of the story is that natural selection operates on anything that is heritable, or in other words, can be inherited between the adult generation and the offspring generation. Now, it could be, certainly in human experience, right? Money is heritable. That can affect your survival and your reproductive outlook as a human. So evolution could operate on how much money you have and are able to give to your offspring. That could be evolutionary. Evolution could operate also on knowledge or things that you teach your offspring or learned behaviors. And this could happen also with animals. So if animals learn behaviors and are able to inculcate their offspring into those kinds of behaviors, that's a heritable trait that could affect their ability to survive and the abundance of their reproduction. And therefore, not only might the horses that you have in Theodore Roosevelt National Park be genetically well adapted, in other words, need less water or be, hardier in terms of severe winter weather or such things, but also might have specific behaviors, might have some familiarity with where the resources are at what times of year, which is something that the young can learn from the older individuals.
And those are things that we've seen, because just like you talked about, the horses move around. Most of the bands move around throughout the seasons. And I do believe most of that is where the water sources are. And even, for example, a couple of years ago when we had really bad drought conditions, we found the horses in places we've never seen them before, but there were natural springs in that area that they were able to access and find. So that makes sense. And then part of what you're saying too about the evolution, then, is it possible, and it's only been, I think, since 2020, because one thing that was mentioned in the article too is what the impact of the park has been removing all of the young horses and selling them off. So we were left with pretty much an older herd, which is now dying off. But in 2020, because of COVID, they've only removed 4 horses since 2020. So it seems like what we're seeing now is this herd almost coming back to like normal behaviors. You know what I mean? Like the mares weren't used to having a new foal and a 1-year-old. So now we get to see the 1-year-old and their role with the new foal. Do you know what I mean? And then just the herd dynamics and, how they're changing because they've had younger horses now. I mean, whereas before, any horse 4 months old to 3 years old, they were taking out of the park. So most of the horses didn't survive past a year in the park. They were taken out and sold on a government surplus website.
Well, you do see all kinds of skewing of the population when you start having manipulations of these wild animals, and particularly wild horses. One of the things that I've seen a lot in the Western United States is that the agency will take off a large number of the population, leaving very few, and then they'll put some back. And the ones they put back are differentially skewed towards the males because they know the males can't get pregnant. And what you end up with in that circumstance is that you have a surplus of males that are fighting for dominance, trying to, split away the mares from the harem masters. And then, they're so desperate to breed that you get breeding of 2-year-olds and even yearlings, and you get young mares that are, mounted to death because these animals are so desperate. And similarly, if they're skewing the age structure, you'll get weird outcomes there too. Of course, when horses are really, really old, they're not going to breed as successfully as, horses that are in their reproductive prime. So you're also probably not going to get the same kinds of, social dynamics either. So, I think when I hear you tell me that they want to manage the population to 30 to 50 animals, that would be managing it to extirpation, whether that's their explicit goal, and they have consulted with biologists, and the biologists have told them, yeah, if you keep them at this low population level and you siphon off all the youngsters, you'll kill off the population. Or whether they're just being ignorant and just don't care enough to find out what's going on. That's the end result is that, trying to maintain a closed population. And I'm assuming because the park is fenced, that it's a pretty closed population. At a level of 30 to 50, same as bison, same as deer, same as elk. If you try to restrict them to those low numbers, you drive that population extinct as well.
So then my other question is that if in the 70s, they took out what is now called the Nakota horse, and they introduced different bloodlines and kind of took that, the pure, I guess, Nakota lines out, and they were, bred with other outside horses that they introduced. Would bringing a Nakota horse back into the park be something, again, because I guess the question is, like, we can't take BLM horses. Like, I don't feel like you could take a BLM from a holding pen in Arizona and put it in North Dakota and be like, hope you make it through the winter, right? But the Dakota horses are still here in North Dakota, and they've, again, evolved to be able to sustain the different weather patterns that we have here. Is that something that you think would be advisable, I guess?
Well, certainly, the local ecotype, the more that you can get the local ecotype for this particular ecosystem and bring that kind of horse in, the better your success is going to be. And also, the less you're going to swamp the genetics of the population with outside genetics. Now, the horses in different parts of the West have all kinds of very different genetics. I mean, there's some of the populations, like I'm aware that south of Crooks Mountain, there are populations of wild horses that at least at one time had a really high degree of the Spanish barb genetics in them, and they'd have the striped fetlocks and the really, kind of the really short stature and all those traits of the Spanish barb. And then in other parts of the same ecosystem south of the interstate, you see horses that obviously, show influence of Percherons or Belgians and big draft horses, and look very, very different. And as you go all around the West, these different herds have different characteristics. And in many cases, the ranchers that were locals would turn out stallions from their ranches to breed with the wild horses, so they could then gather the offspring, break them to ride, and use them in their operations. And that's a big part of the history of wild horses of the West, is that the ranchers kind of looked upon them as a, kind of a wellspring of additional saddle stock. And so, as a consequence of this, depending on what was put out there, some horses, some herds of wild horses look like they have a lot of Morgans in them, I mean, from a domestic standpoint. And some, have a lot of Appaloosas. And so that could have been an indigenous influence, right? And so they're really different. And I do think that to the extent that there are Nakota horses that are left out there and could be brought in and introduced and interbreed and intermingle with this herd, that would be a benefit just from an ecosystem fit standpoint.
Okay. That's interesting too. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about, I know I've seen a lot of very interesting pictures just kind of quickly in some of the posts that you've been doing with how the range, the Western range repairs itself when you take the livestock off. Do you want to talk about some of that? I know some people were interested in that. We talked earlier.
Well, certainly I don't have any photos immediately handy, although I could probably pull some up. There were last week, my staff was on Tuesday in a biocrust and vegetation workshop in Contact, Nevada, which is in far northeastern Nevada. I'll go ahead and maybe go to our Facebook page here and pull up some of those photos and share my screen. And then folks can take a look at what we were able to see out there in terms of the kind of the differences. So here I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay, so here you can see in this photograph, you can see an exclosure that was built around a spring. And on the left side, you can see mostly invasive species because this area around this spring has been heavily hammered by livestock. And sometimes the panels are removed and the livestock are let in and the livestock graze the heck out of it. But right now there's exclosure. So on the right side of the photograph here, you see the area that has been grazed by cattle down to bare dirt. And on the left, you can see the area that's protected inside this exclosure fence. And again, these yellow flowered plants are an invasive mustard. The grasses are largely cheatgrass, which is an invasive weed, but it's green and lush. And outside, it's desertified, and that's the impact of livestock grazing. Here's a look inside the fence. You can see kind of the difference in productivity, and you take a look at the same direction looking down the valley and see the level of impact. Now I can also show you some other photographs that are pretty interesting, if I can find them. Here's a nice pairing. So this is a kind of an upland scenario where we're outside of exclosure fence, and what you see is in the foreground you have some rabbit brush, which came back after a fire that happened in 2005. There's not a whole lot of sagebrush because the sagebrush doesn't come back after fires. But what does come back is this cheatgrass if you're heavily grazed. Okay, and this purple stuff in the midground is all cheatgrass, and it's a very flammable invasive weed. It's an annual plant. And so it starts its seed in the fall and overwinters as a small basal rosette, or else it sprouts in the springtime. But even if it sprouts in the springtime, it sprouts at least 2 weeks earlier than the native grasses. So it sends its roots down and monopolizes the soil moisture and nutrients, and then the native grasses can't grow. And the more continuous disturbance you have, you can maintain this cheatgrass in the understory. And then, of course, it grows for 6 weeks in the spring. Then in the middle of June, it dies, sets seed, dies, turns brown, dries out, becomes tinder, and this can burn as rapidly as a 5 to 30 year rotation of fire, and it kills off the sagebrush. It kind of excludes along with overgrazing, excludes the native bunch grasses. Now, this is an exclosure inside an exclosure fence that the BLM built in the same area. It was treated in the same way, but 3 years ago, they built an exclosure fence to keep the cows out. And inside this fence, you can see all kinds of bunch grasses. Some of them are native bunch grasses. Some of them are the invasive bunch grasses that the BLM planted post-fire, because they do that, because ecologically stupid. But you can see that if you exclude the cattle, then this is what you get. But if you keep grazing it, this is what you get. And you can see also the difference in productivity. You can imagine how many pounds per acre of forage you have here versus this annual grass. And then when this annual grass dries out and browns up, it's not going to have any forage value. It doesn't have any nitrogen or other nutrients. It doesn't have any cell solubles. It's basically straw. And straw with sharp seed awns that get embedded in the cattle's mouths and eyes and give them sores as well on top of all of it. So that's a bad situation as well. And then I'll see if I can find one more series here. Here's another series. This is a series that's from a landowner's exclosure that was also built 3 years ago. And inside the exclosure, these are native plants. And here the landowner didn't plant anything. They didn't plant the crested wheatgrass, which is the invasive bunch grass. They just let it alone after it burned. And here they have coming back foxtail or squirrel tail, and we have blue bunch wheatgrass in the foreground, just coming back naturally after only 3 years of rest from livestock grazing. And then right on the other side of the fence, this is what it looks like with all this cheatgrass, and that's all you get. And you don't see a single squirrel tail. You don't see a single blue bunch wheatgrass. There's no Indian ricegrass. There's no fescue, none of the native species. It's basically a monoculture of weeds. And so that's kind of the story in the West about how you get these kind of invasive weed monocultures as a result of heavy livestock grazing. And if you rest, you can get it back. And it's not all going to come back as fast as it did in this circumstance here. I mean, this Contact Nevada is not, it's desert, but it's not as dry as some parts of Nevada. And also it's had a really wet year. In some places, it might take you 30, 50, 80 years to come back to native vegetation, but nature will find a way. But if you keep disturbing it with livestock, then you're going to keep reconditioning the soil and the vegetation to invasion with cheatgrass.
And then I don't know if you can talk about, just for anyone who might not know, what are the impacts of grazing for wild horses in those areas around those lands?
Well, the wild horses, they forage a lot differently, and I'll bring up a couple of slides here and share my screen. This is in 2021 when I went out to the Onakee Wild Horse Herd Management Area, and this is in the herd management area. Okay, so this is an area that's been grazed by cattle, and if you really strain your eyeballs, you might be able to see these little black dots through here, and there are about 200 Angus cattle that are grazing out here on the flats. In the foreground, what you see is that they have grazed this down to bare dirt. This is 99% forage utilization. They have eaten all of it. And this is because it's within 1 mile of water. And cattle evolved in the boggy forests of Northern Europe, where it has lots of rainfall and lush vegetation, and they like to be in lush vegetation places. So they like to be close to water, and they don't like to go far from water. On that same trip, on that same herd management area, this is a photograph of where the wild horses were, and you can see the difference. There are native bunch grasses. The native bunch grasses are often more than 7 inches tall. These horses are out in vegetation that's doing quite well, and they're in good shape because they can go up to 20 miles away from water, finding these areas with abundant vegetation where the cattle are stuck next to the water, grazing it down to dirt. Now, there was an interesting story with this Onakee herd, which was, at that time, there was a 33,000 acre exclosure that was behind a fence. They had removed all the wild horses. There had been a fire. They'd set up a fence, and they'd kept all the livestock off for 3 years after the fire and planted the crested wheatgrass, which is the invasive bunch grass, to try and recover the range. And in February of 2021, you can see here, they have bunch grasses that have come back. After 3 years, they had a grass bank that was 33,000 acres in size. And also, as you can see in this photograph, they had let cattle into the exclosure, and they put about 250 plus cattle in this exclosure to take advantage of this forage bank. So meanwhile, in this case, while at the same time, the Bureau of Land Management was saying, oh, the wild horses are overpopulated, there's not enough forage for the wild horses, we have to get rid of the wild horses. They had this 33,000 acre forage bank that was sitting there that was part of the wild horse herd management area that they were keeping the horses out of and wouldn't let them into, and instead gave it to the cattle. And then when I came back in April of 2021, this is what that exclosure looked like. The cattle had eaten that down into bare dirt, and they had wiped it out entirely. So the whole emergency stabilization and rehabilitation effort that they had put in to plant these crested wheatgrass was entirely destroyed by heavy overgrazing by domestic livestock. And at the same time, the wild horses, and here's another photograph of what that moonscape looked like. You can see the cattle are right the trough here inside this exclosure. And in April of 2021, where were the horses? Well, the horses were out in other parts here, and you can see you've got grass tufts that are 14 inches tall where the horses were. So they're smart enough to find the areas that have good grasses. And even in the areas that had sage grouse habitat, which is just the very far southern part of the Anakie, has sage grouse habitat. The magic number for sage grouse is 7-inch grass height. If you don't have 7-inch grass height, the sage grouse can't hide from their predators because they don't have cover. Here you can see you've got the grass height. That's the appropriate size for the sage grouse in this area. So consequently, the conclusion that you can reach from all of this is that, the wild horses have a much lesser impact on the vegetation base because they're spreading their grazing over a much more vast area. So that means less nibbles per square meter than cattle, which are concentrating along the riparian areas near the water troughs, in the areas of lush vegetation, really beating it down.
So then to bring this back to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, what about bison and how do they graze?
Well, bison graze an awful lot like wild horses. And in a place as small as Theodore Roosevelt National Park, you might, you're probably not really seeing natural bison grazing either, right? Because the bison are confined to this national park that's a certain amount of tens of thousands of acres. But under natural conditions on the Great Plains, you'd have bison populations that had herds in the millions they would mow along and they would nibble everything down to dirt, but they would be, 500 miles away in 2 weeks. And they might not get back to that spot for another 3 years. And so it was a much different kind of pattern of grazing. And the more you kind of fence bison into a smaller and smaller and smaller area, the more they graze like cattle because they can't spread out because they're limited. But bison, given the ability to spread out, will spread out just like wild horses. They'll forage on steeper terrain. They'll forage farther from water. They'll take advantage of resources in a much more even fashion, just like horses do, in contrast to cattle. And the other thing that's interesting about both bison and wild horses is they're neither of them terribly selective, whereas cattle are extremely selective. So if there are palatable species that cattle prefer, like some of these bunch grasses, like the blue bunch wheatgrass, or these are called ice cream plants by us biologists, right? Because they're the ones they want to go for first.
Right.
And they'll graze them out and ignore the less palatable species. Whereas a bison or a horse is more apt to pretty much graze everything pretty evenly and not pick on certain plants because they find them more palatable.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not so when the park is saying that the horses need to go so that there's more forage for the other large ungulates, and I guess what do you say to that narrative that they're feeding the public?
Well, I mean, ultimately the question is, are the other ungulates suffering? And if the other ungulates are showing signs that competition is so severe that they're having reproductive failure, where they're not having any calves or fawns, or, you can see that they're in very poor body condition, then you can make the case that there are too many ungulates out there. It's not necessarily that one ungulate is overpopulated versus another. It's a collective grazing load on the forage base. So they're all grazing together in a collective. And so, yeah, it's true. If you take one species out entirely, that releases the others from the competition a little bit, and they might increase their populations a little bit. I would say that if, one of the things that from what you're telling me about numbers, a couple hundred wild horses, 600 to 800 bison, you might think about whether it's possible to enlarge the national park and having a larger unfenced area for all of this ungulate assemblage to use and take advantage of. Because the bigger the area, the more the bison can spread out and forage in a way that's more natural to them, the more the elk will have special niches to find that are uniquely suited to them. And, with the wild horses, you've got populations that even today, may be a little below minimum viable population from a genetic standpoint. You can add more forage, and the way that you add more forage is you add more acres. And, you can buy up neighboring ranches, and the federal government could do that and expand the national park if it had politicians that wanted to get behind that and say, hey, this is what we want to do. And with a bigger national park, it's going to be a bigger draw for the public. It's going to be a bigger economic engine for the tourism industry. And the state of North Dakota may decide, and the North Dakota congressional delegation may decide that, hey, look, this is a win-win for everybody. We can offer a king's ransom for a price for these ranches, and the ranchers can go away wealthy and happy and, buy themselves a vacation home in the Caribbean somewhere. And the horses and the bison and the, and the elk and whatever else you have. I don't even know if you have bighorn sheep, do you?
There's bighorn sheep in the north unit.
Yeah, bighorn
But
sheep, all of these will have a much better shot at thriving. And, if you get it big enough, you'll rival Yellowstone for your wildlife. And then all of a sudden, all the people from Minnesota, instead of going out to Yellowstone to see all the bison and the elk, they'll be stopping in Medora instead and spending their tourist dollars there. And that's
I think
a hell of a selling point.
I think that that's a great option that I don't think that anyone's brought up or considered, but I do believe that a lot of the land that surrounds the park is BLM land that's being grazed on by cattle. So I think that that would put us in probably the same argument that other wild horses are, correct?
Well, it could, yeah, it could. And at the same time, it ain't necessarily so that, that the BLM has to graze it for cattle. And you can, there's this thing called voluntary grazing permit buyout. And especially if you have legislation that says that if you buy out the grazing permit, then you can close it permanently, then conservation groups who have the money to do this, and WWP has its own fund that's from a pipeline settlement called the Sagebrush Habitat Conservation Fund that does this. It exists for this purpose, to buy out grazing permits. And in those places like the Boulder White Clouds Wilderness or the Owyhee Canyon lands, where the legislation says if you buy it out, then we'll close it forever, and then the wildlife or the wild horses or what have you have access to all that forage that used to go into a cow, then that's really attractive for a conservation group with money and wanting to invest in that model. If you don't have that legislation, on the other hand, then what happens is if the conservation group buys out the grazing lease, they've got two choices. They can either hold the grazing lease, which means they have to put livestock on it themselves. And that's what happened to the Grand Canyon Trust, is that they bought a bunch of grazing permits to try and get cattle off of the rims of the Grand Canyon. Then they found out that the Bureau of Land Management would only let them take conservation non-use on 3 of every 10 years. And so they had to get into the livestock business in order to hold their permits. Or the other thing that you can do is that you can buy the permit out and surrender it back to the agency and hope that they don't put ranchers back on to the lands you just bought out. And the Sagebrush Fund is learning a very bitter lesson right now. They and the National Wildlife Federation and the Knobloch Family Foundation bought out together between all of them about 500,000 acres on the Bridger Teton National Forest, where there were conflicts between sheep, domestic sheep and bighorn sheep. There were conflicts between cattle and grizzly bears and wolves. And they bought off this 500,000 acres to solve all these wildlife conflicts. And the forest supervisor said, oh, don't worry, you can buy those out, and rest assured we'll never put cows and sheep on those because we don't have enough money to do our NEPA right now. This will go to the bottom of the NEPA list. We don't want to do it. You'll never have to worry about it ever again being grazed by cattle and sheep. And then that forest supervisor was shuffled off to some other position, and a new forest supervisor came in. And then the Wyoming legislature appropriated $200,000 to have NEPA done to reinstate cattle on these bought out allotments, and went charging into the forest supervisor's office saying, we demand that you put this on top of your priority list for a new NEPA to reopen these closed grazing allotments so that we can reinstitute the same problems that we had 8 years ago. And that investment then by the Sagebrush Fund and all its partners now looks like it's going to be come to nothing in some places because the Forest Service couldn't be trusted to its word. It didn't have the legislative requirement to close it, and that's why with North Dakota, my understanding is that you have a delegation that's somewhat supportive of the wild horses. You might be able to get them to have, to say, okay, we're going to put legislation in place that in North Dakota on public lands, you can buy out up to 25 grazing permits per year. And that kind of legislation was introduced last Congress by a New Mexico senator. That could be done in North Dakota too. And under those circumstances, you could, kind of buy out the grazing permits. And the livestock industry is very politically powerful, but I also think that it's an easier political feat to buy a permit on the open market from a willing seller. There's no victim there, right? It's not like you're saying we're going to kick all the cows out, and even though you were just renters, we're just going to stop renting to you. The livestock permittee will scream bloody murder. But if you're coming with a suitcase of money and saying, if you want to sell, here's an option, that's a way to go. Now, the other thing about the BLM lands and how they work with wild horses, and this is really, I think a key issue all around the country that everybody should understand about wild horses. Wild horses can't really get overpopulated and overgraze the range in areas that have domestic livestock also. And almost 100% of the wild horse herd management areas have domestic livestock also. The reason they can't get overpopulated and the reason they can't overgraze is that the grazing permits for the domestic livestock allocate 50 to 65% of all the forage that grows for the entire year to the livestock. So the wild horses can't eat the majority of the forage if they want to, because it's already going into cattle and sheep.
Crazy. Julie, did that answer your question about, she wanted to know how you close the loophole, and I think that you went through that and answered. And then another question that I have for you is,
well, wait, before you go on, there's also another option. In the West and on BLM lands, the Bureau of Land Management has regulations for the Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act, and one of those regulations is 43 CFR 4710.5, which is closure to livestock. And that regulation states that on any wild horse herd management area, that the Bureau of Land Management has the authority to close that herd management area to any or all classes of livestock for the benefit of the wild horses. They can do that temporarily or permanently. It's just an option that the agency never exercises.
right,
But Congress, directed the agency to identify these areas where the wild horses exist and then manage for them as part of the landscape. And the agency instead is, kind of looking at the wild horses as a pest species and as the domestic livestock as what they should be focusing on, even in areas designated as a wild horse herd management area.
I feel like we never learn from history, from all the mistakes that we make in history. Like we just continue to make similar mistakes. The bison went almost extinct, and then now I feel like we're doing the same thing to wild horses, in a sense.
Yeah, I think that's true. And some of the same dynamics have been at play. The livestock industry had this philosophy of manifest destiny and taming the wilderness. And that was all about eliminating all of the wildness out of the land and all of the native species that were inconvenient. And so they had to get rid of the wolves, and they drove them extinct south of Canada, except for a little cluster around Minnesota. They drove the grizzly bears extinct everywhere except for Yellowstone and Glacier. They drove mountain lions extinct across vast areas of the West. They tried to drive coyotes extinct, but the more they killed them, the more they reproduced, and now they've got more coyotes and more area than they ever have. They poisoned out the prairie dogs, and now we have prairie dogs on 5% of the land where we used to, and the black-footed ferrets are going extinct because they need prairie dogs to survive. So, I mean, the ecological collapse all comes back to the idea that instead of coexisting with native wildlife, we need to wipe the slate clean of all the other wildlife so that we can have domestic cattle pastures to maximize beef production and to maximize wool production for domestic sheep. And that's the priority. But that's not necessarily the way that these public lands have been set up to be managed. You know, the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service both have multiple use mandates, and those multiple use mandates state that wildlife is a multiple use, just like range or livestock grazing.
The other question I have for you is, in the National Academy of Sciences report, the BLM report that they have, one of the things that they talk about in there that I found interesting through this process is talking about the park as its own ecosystem. And so what would be the impact on the park as a whole, removing 200 horses that have always been there? Because I don't feel like that's talked about enough.
I don't know the answer to that, because I've never seen a scientific study that examined the kind of the consequences of removal of wild horses. It certainly has happened often enough that you could have had such a study.
Right.
About somewhere between 40 and 50% of all of the original herd management areas are now at zero and don't have any wild horses. So you could have done that experiment, before after controlled experiment, which was really rigorous, and found out the answer to that. And because nobody's ever asked the question and done the hypothesis testing, we don't have the information. At least I don't.
Craig Downer, when we talked to him a couple weeks ago, said it would, for the park, it would be almost like a literal heart attack as it tried to, go back into balance without that species there and the role that it played.
Well, wild horses have been part of the herbivore assemblage in that park for a really, really long time. Everything in an ecosystem that's part of that, that's having an impact on that ecosystem is changing it in subtle ways. And, we humans, and especially wildlife managers, and I was trained as one, so I have to raise my hand and say, yep, I was trained this way too. We think that nature does better the more human tinkering that we do with it. But it's kind of like having your dentist working on an IndyCar engine. He's not really qualified. He might be a really good dentist, but he might not know diddly squat about a 24-cylinder engine.
Right.
So, we're really out of our depth in a lot of ways. And, we make these big, bold statements like, we know how to fix this problem. But you know what? Before modern wildlife management, before the North American model was there, before, Aldo Leopold, at the time of Lewis and Clark, there was no human control or management of any of these species. And the wild horses were there too. And there were 2 to 7 million wild horses at the time of Lewis and Clark in the American West. And they were part of that, that ecological landscape that Lewis and Clark set foot into as they went west from the up the Missouri. And that landscape was healthier back then, with more abundant wildlife than anything that anybody alive has ever seen today, without any human interference. And what that tells you is Mother Nature is a much better wildlife manager than any state or federal agency.
I think we all would agree on that. Does anybody else have any questions for Erik? No, I really appreciate your time. This was very interesting as always. And I appreciate all your help and support that you've given for the horses here and horses on the Western Range. And thank you. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me on, and thanks for everybody paying attention to healthy native ecosystems and all those species. And, I think that wild horses can be part of that mix.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.